So I will introduce Alan and Louise, who's also there to catch us up with the status and what they know about the airport. Alan, thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you for the introduction. I did want to state that as part of my background, I worked in semiconductor R&D for 47 years, so it's very likely that some of the chips in your cell phones today have chips that were produced by the processes we developed at my former locations. I also wanted to thank Louise and also Cindy. A lot of the content here came from their foraging through various agencies and sites and FOIA requests. So just wanted to thank them. So, based on that, it has to be correct, right? Okay, so with that, let me get started. Just wanted to talk about the Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University's plan for an airport within the Ocala National Forest. This is something that's been evidently in the works for several years, but we got wind of it more recently. I'll give you a little bit of history here. So it's quite a long agenda I have here, somewhere close to 70 slides. Somewhere close to 70 slides here. I want to start off with the background. So back in 1987, John Schmale, who owned the property, obtained a CUP from Lake County to operate a private airstrip in this property of his, Deep Woods Ranch. And on the left side here, you can see the airport and the runway. This is actually as it currently stands from Google Earth. On the right side, you can see where the runway kind of fits in a larger view of the area with obviously quite a few water bodies, wetlands, and some of the smaller towns to the south. I'll go into more detail on that later. So after the CUP was granted, he applied for an application to FDOT, and some of the salient features here lists a 2,000-foot sod surface runway. And he also did not check aviation school instruction and training. And he also indicated that the airstrip is intended for private use by family and friends on invitation. And then in discussing this with the Forestry Service and in getting their approval, they stated it was okay as long as the approach to the airstrip will not require the removal of any trees or vegetation from national forest land. Now, however, back in 2004 timeframe, a small section of trees were actually removed from both ends of the runway, totaling about 5 acres. But nothing has been harvested since then in the past 22 years. So if we look at the initial concept map, this shows a proposed 2,200-foot runway, again, as opposed to the 2,000-foot runway listed on the application. And it is still currently a sod runway, but is pending Embry-Riddle's intended construction to pave it. And if we take a look again closer at the concept plan, what's interesting is that this runway seems to bisect a pond here. And if we look at the 1984 map, you can see that the wetlands and ponds are kind of continuous here, but you can see it's bisected in the 1987 map to the lower right. And it's very unlikely, of course, that this was permitted at the time with St. John's Water Management District, River Water Management District. So back in 2006, the CUP was amended, and it was amended primarily to allow subdivision of the property. It was an ag lot split. And what's interesting is at the bottom here, it actually states that they extend the rights of use of the airstrip to anticipated owners, so the buyers of the other two properties. And then back in 2017, what's interesting is that John Schmale actually let his registration for the airport lapse, and this is with FDOT. So you can see there were repeated attempts here to try to contact him to get the renewal, but there's been no renewal of this airport since 2017. So 9 years of it's been essentially vacated. Around the middle of 2024, Embry-Riddle came in, began working with Kim Schmale, who's John's son. John had passed away. to develop and purchase the property. Their plan was to revoke the CUP, rezone the 118 acres from Ag to Community Facility District, CFD, and it was going to occur in multiple phases. The first phase was to actually just pave the runway to meet FAA standards so they can start using it as a training center. And then subsequent phases would include classrooms, hangars, and even more advanced like drone research development, autonomous vehicle research development. And this was met with significant pushback from the public, and that prompted Embry-Riddle to actually shift the strategy and withdraw the CFD rezoning application. This is the timeline of the events up to withdrawal. What's interesting here is that on June 2nd, Tara Tedra, who was Embry-Riddle's attorney, submitted the withdrawal letter stating that Embry-Riddle will operate as a student pilot training center only under the existing 2006 CUP. And the county attorney, Melanie Marsh, endorsed this theory, so no rezoning needed for this airstrip. So back on June 3rd at the commissioners' meeting, she formally withdrew the CFD application. We think that this was actually strategic and not a concession because they needed this application to prove the existing CUP was insufficient, but at least for their training, it is sufficient. And the withdrawal avoided the one public proceeding, this BCC meeting, where residents could actually challenge the project. So if we look at the withdrawal letter, there were actually 4 places where there were misrepresentations. And on the next page, I list these. The first is this claimed FAA licensure. And in fact, there is no FAA license existing. It's all handled by FDOT, as I showed on one of the earlier slides. The only thing that involves the FAA is this Part 157 determination if any alterations to an airport is planned, which it is going to happen according to Embry-Riddle. But no new notifications reflecting this has been filed to the FAA, at least up to this point. The second is it treated Embry-Riddle's property as a single parcel covered by the CUP. What Embry-Riddle actually purchased were 2 properties. One was the homestead of this Kim Schmale, which was actually a little donut hole property not included in any of the CUPs. So there's no permit authorizing aviation use on this little piece of property. The other is all key, 3859087, which is one of the 3 subdivided parcels originally listed in the CUP, and each is owned by a different person. The third is treating the paved runway as permitted. The 1980 FDOT site approval order specifies a sod landing surface. Paving requires separate authorization, which has not been sought. And the fourth is it ignored the multi-owner CUP problem. That 2006 CUP covered 3 parcels owned by different entities. This is not resolved and still an issue. And according to the CUP, these other 2 owners actually retain airstrip rights. So the county attorney supported this decision without identifying any of these deficiencies, which a public hearing, if it had not been canceled, would have brought these to light. Okay, so here's an email now that indicates that the paving of the runway was okay per the CUP. But according to the county attorney, this was her own interpretation, is really one of omission. The CUP doesn't state that paving is prohibited, so then it must be allowed. However, that type of argument really doesn't work since it implies that anything not listed can be constructed. So really the CUP is specific in what is allowed, not what is not allowable. And then if we take a look at the updated airport registration with FDOT, this was performed by Embry-Riddle on 12/23/2025, just at the end of last year. And you can see they essentially took the same original expired airport registration and just essentially renewed it. So this happened despite possible significant changes in intent. without a full review, without any public announcement or notification to adjacent property owners, which is normally required when there's a new registration being sought. Okay, now something that Susan was kind of alluding to, the Embry-Riddle Airport, or Deepwoods Ranch Airport, is located here in the center of the picture. And you can see that surrounding it is a lot of nice features of the Ocala National Forest, including Alexander Springs Wilderness, Lake Woodruff National Wildlife Refuge. There are towns, Deer Haven, Lake Catherine, Fullerville, Lake McForest Hills, and St. Francis Trails over on the right side. And this is also entirely within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And here you can see on an expanded map, the airport again sitting somewhere here close to the center of the picture. But the north-south Florida Wildlife Corridor actually goes through the airport region. And this includes, of course, parts of Lake County, Seminole County, and Volusia County. So what many residents in Lake County incorrectly assumed is that when they withdrew the CFD, it also meant the project had completely died, which it didn't. Embry-Riddle continues to pursue a very high-intent student flight training airport under the existing CUP. And this impact is dawn to dusk, 7 days per week, 50 weeks per year, with up to 5 planes in constant rotation performing touch-and-go landings. What we said is this is really a foot-in-door strategy, but we don't know what it's leading to, what's going to be next. We do believe Embry-Riddle wants to come back at some point once they got the foot in the door to do some sort of expansion. Okay, let's talk about the association between Embry-Riddle and Lake County. So on September 2024, there was a meeting held on the Daytona Beach Embry-Riddle campus, and Tyler Soroy was the main host for the event. And that included our Lake County Commission Chairman, Leslie Campione, and the Development Director, Megan Brew. So who is Tyler Soroy and what's his involvement here? He actually has 2 roles. He is the Vice President of External Affairs and Strategic Initiatives, which was a new position very likely created for him. He's more importantly, though, still a member of the Florida House of Rep, and that's term limited through the end of 2026. He serves as a House Majority Leader. He controls the House floor agenda. He influences budget proposals, and he has oversights over state agencies. So very, very powerful person to have on your team. However, what we think is this is a very possible conflict. His goal of developing relationships with government officials actually collapses when he is the government official. His colleagues in the legislature are the very people his lobbyists would otherwise need to influence. His presence on Embry-Riddle's payroll is the lobby. So, even if it's a conflict of interest, we did ask county attorney about that possibility, and her answer was that because because Tyler doesn't reside in Lake County, you would have to seek answers outside of this county, that the county is not really involved. Okay, and then in the subsequent 7 months from that initial meeting, there were likely continued discussions between Lake County staff and Embry-Riddle regarding this airport. There was no public knowledge of this until it really came to the notification to the public for the meetings. But we did see from a FOIA request, internal county staff referencing this as a Commissioner Campione priority related to Embry-Riddle. Obviously, very important project. Now let's talk about the CUP violations. On the right is that concept map I showed earlier, and we actually highlighted 8 different violations. Most of them are associated with setback rules for roads and buildings. And it doesn't really matter which CUP it involves, the original or the revised CUP, because there were really no changes to the aspects of the site plan or layout. However, what followed after we submitted this these complaints to code enforcement was not an independent investigation. The code director, this is Glenn Guzman, he spoke with the attorney, Tara Tedrow, for Embry-Riddle. She facilitated a site visit for the director. And then she also sent the director her point-by-point rebuttal and said the issues raised do not form a valid basis for any code enforcement violations. So after thanking Tara Tedrow, she presses, we close next week and would like to be sure we understand whether any issues exist prior to closing. And these are quoted. Glenn indicated that there were no violations found. However, if you read the reply back to us, it actually mirrors, because we also have from FOIA requests, the original arguments back from the attorney, and it actually mirrors the attorney's argument word for word. So what we essentially got back from code enforcement was the attorney's wording. So based on that, they said there's no violations, and Embry-Riddle was able to close on the 2 properties the following day. So when we listed the violations, this is one specific part of the CUP. It states that runway shall not be less than 300 feet from nearest right-of-way or 800 feet from nearest existing dwelling or building. It is really virtually impossible to misinterpret this statement from the CUP. It either violates or not. And according to everything that we've shown, it does violate those right-of-ways and those buildings. However, since it was predicated, their purchase of the property was predicated on dismissal of these violations, that was given to them, and the purchase occurred on July 10th. In addition to that, institutional use is not covered by current zoning or CUP. The property is currently zoned ag, but per Lake County's own LDR regulations, Chapter 3, an airport is only allowed within heavy manufacturing, planned industrial, or CFD. CFD is what they were looking for. A college or university is allowed, but only if there's a CUP that specifically allows that usage. So here you can see college or university listed under ag, and then airport here on the right listed under those 3 categories. Neither of these fit, so Embry-Riddle's high-volume airport and or university should be prohibited from this particular location unless they go for a CFD or a university-specific CUP. And in addition to that, the 3-parcel subdivision, which was addressed by the amended 2006 CUP, it brings up a couple other issues. Embry-Riddle purchases included the 2 properties, but only the larger parcel was part of the original CUP, which I mentioned before. This parcel, the original parcel, was subdivided into 3 parcels in 2006. The all-key listed in 2006 CUP no longer belongs to Embry-Riddle. Embry-Riddle's parcel is this all-key and this all-key. The one that was originally subdivided belongs to the property owner just south of the airstrip. So it would indicate that the CUP is not up to date and should be revised to reflect this. The CUP also in the application referred to owners and guests. Hundreds of tuition-paying students do not qualify as guests. So regardless, the clear intent of the CUP in 2006 was to provide airport access to the other landowners who purchased these subdivided properties, again, listed in the CUP directly. Let's talk now about the forestry special use permit. So Embry-Riddle applied for a special use permit. This is the number here and the link. It's a revision from a prior permit because they had included new information in the site plan. That application permit includes several requests. It includes runway widening, paving, taxiway paving and expansion, some farm road improvements for access, and recontouring for a smooth, safe landing surface. This application conveniently omits tree harvesting in the Ocala National Forest, borrow pits in the Ocala National Forest, or creation of a new National Forestry access road to bypass an existing legal easement. So if we take a look at the map of the proposal, you can see it's quite extensive. There's a lot that they're planning to do. But if you take a look at where the boundary of the property is, much of this construction is actually off-site. It's not even within this parcel. The only thing within this parcel is really the taxiway expansion, the paving of the runway, and maybe a hangar somewhere in here. So significant attributes of the revised plan include 36 plus acres of tree removal from the adjacent property for safety reasons. This may be a small reduction from the initial 39 acres. The drawing they included was removed and then included separately, but that showed borrow pits. Borrow pits are where you take fill from the pit, you dig into the pit, and you can remove it and use it elsewhere. So 5 borrow pits were listed, again, presumably to help fill and level the runway. 2 of those are actually listed, but not on Embry-Riddle property. It's actually on the Ocala National Forest property, adjacent property. And a fence has been also added to the drawing. Embry-Riddle appears to be attempting to eliminate the legal easement the property owners to the south use to access their properties. And I'll show that here. So if you look at the map on the right, there's a legal easement coming in, and that's the right side white line that curves here and then down. This is actually the road that goes within Embry-Riddle property and then out into the southern owners' properties. This thin white line on the outside here is actually the border of the property. So what Embry-Riddle has requested is that this legal easement is now going to be routed outside into Ocala National Forest land and then back and routed back into the legal easement again so that they have access to their properties. This is to fulfill the requirement that there needs to be a setback from the end of the runway to the road, but they're requesting that this legal easement essentially be vacated and the property owners south would no longer have a legal easement because this is forestry property. So this is essentially a road to nowhere. And how can this legal easement be bypassed? And then in terms of airstrip leveling, if we look at the side view of the runway, it actually goes from a 50-foot elevation on both ends to a 40-foot elevation in the middle. So it's about a 10-foot drop. Fill will be needed to level the runway before paving. This low spot actually currently puddles when we have heavy rains, so it actually floods to a certain point. The runway is about 2,700 feet long, and this dot that I put in here represents buried power and phone lines to the southern property. So there's actually a utility easement that's located here that runs underneath the runway. Once you bury that, this line's going to be about 14 feet deep. However, if we take a look at the amount of fill, we're kind of estimating that this will require 61,000 cubic yards of fill, or about 5,000 loads of dump trucks, and that's large dump truck loads. That's not including the taxiway, which would probably add another 20–30% more. However, in actuality, it looks like the amount of excavation and fill being moved around is about 3 times what I had said, about 193,000 cubic yards, or 13,000 dump truck loads. And this table actually comes from the St. John's website, where they're trying to apply for an environmental resource permit, ERP, and it was not provided at all to forestry staff. So we're asking, how can forestry make a decision if it hasn't been provided all of the data? Okay, and then when we talk about the borrow pits, here's the right side, the east side border, property border with this dashed line. Embry-Riddle is to the left and the runway is here. On the right side is actually listed borrow pits number 4 and 5. I suspect it's not just this high point here, but these high points back here as well that will become borrow pits to provide fill for the runway. The comment here is that no property owner should ever expect an adjacent neighbor to give up land, trees, and fill for their own private use. Embry-Riddle should not have purchased knowing that the property was insufficient for their needs. And there's no request for the fill listed on the forestry application or documents either. So is this a comedy of errors when we were trying to get comments submitted to the forestry unit, or was it? So at the right here, and this is on 3/23, March 23rd, There was an email that was inadvertently sent back to me, wasn't meant to be sent to me, but they indicated that they were not going to have a formal commenting period for this forestry application. But once this was sent upline, and again, inadvertent to me, they had recalled the email, but I had seen it. They did open it up for comments, but this is roughly a week on the 23rd, 8 days before the decision date, which is March 31st. However, the submission link for the button was broken, and that was confirmed by forestry staff on the next day. So we only had 7 days left to do any commenting. And Forestry Service actually wrote back and suggested that we do postal mail with 7 days left. Requests were then made directly to Forestry Service staff, and at that point, emails or contacts to Senator Trunau's office was also made. They replied that the commenting button was working again. That was March 27th now. So we only had 4 days left to provide comments and send out the message. And essentially over the last 3 days, there were 500 comments submitted. So instead of getting a typical 14 days for commenting, we only really had a period of 4 days that it worked. Now, when we talk about Forestry Service, this may be a case for segmentation. And what is segmentation? First of all, under NEPA, federal agencies must evaluate connected actions together. So they need to evaluate the entire property. Smaller properties can be classified as CE, categorical exclusion, which reduces paperwork and requirements, but also eliminates the commenting period. And that's what happened here for this project. So we were told, and this is a letter back to Louise, that it was categorically excluded from documentation. So this, when a project does not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect, you can assign CE to it. And this is an effect on the human environment and or which therefore neither an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement is required. So they deemed that this project didn't impact the human environment or the environmental impact wasn't significant enough. However, if we take a look at their scoping letter to Friends of Ocala National Forest, they indicate a few of these requests were made to them by Embry-Riddle, one of which is improve 20 acres of Ocala National Forest surrounding the airstrip. However, we know that the report states it's going to be 39 acres to be improved. We believe that the scoping letter only listed 20 acres, which was small enough to provide categorical exclusion status. Why this matters is that the agency had all of the documents, and they had them since January. So they had it for several months, but they only presented part of it to the public. That's not just a gap in analysis, it's a gap in disclosure. And this segmenting may actually be happening in this case to try to get this project moved on without rigorous review. So what about the birds? An environmental evaluation, a one-day September 25th evaluation, a snapshot in time, was performed, but we all know that that's typically insufficient to map out all of the birds who live in the area. And this really focuses on endangered or threatened species, and the list was provided in the documentation as such. So not really many birds are listed here. However, as recently as last week, Louise and I went out and we saw some threatened birds that were actually habitating a pond 200 feet away from the runway on Embry-Riddle property. And that included the rosette spoonbill, the blue heron, and the white ibis. And then on this property, which is the southern property owner, the adjacent property owner, there were actually wood storks sighted, again, spoonbills, heron, ibises, and sandhill cranes, all threatened species. These were all missing from the Stantec study that was done for Embry-Riddle, despite being in very close proximity to the runway. And these are all very large birds. And some of these pictures are the ones that we took while we're visiting out there. What's significant is that within this group of 9 birds on the right here, 4 are from a family of rosette spoonbills, and 4 are a family from white ibis. And likely even the immature blue heron has the family nearby because it's not fully mature. What's significant about that is family groupings indicate localized nesting and foraging areas. So these should have been part of the state threatened listing that Stantec provided to Embry-Riddle, but obviously was missing. Okay, in terms of safety concerns, there are a number of concerns. We'll start with bird strike dangers. We just saw that there are a number of large birds in the area. The second is there's a lot of restricted airspace present to the north and west. There are nearby high voltage transmission line towers present very close to the end of the runway, and emergency access is very limited due to the roads and in case of a crash in the woods. Here's the runway in the picture. You can see the hangar behind it, and here are the birds in front. The birds actually took off at one point and went right over the runway. And these can easily damage small planes if they are hit. Now, so the FAA requires a wildlife hazard assessment, WHA, where bird strikes or wildlife poses a risk to aviation operations. But since none of these were really evaluated, Stantec only evaluated impacts on the ground. No WHA report was conducted for Deep Woods Ranch. So no agency has evaluated the bird strike risk from operating a flight training facility in the middle of the Ocala National Forest and the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And then in terms of restricted airspace, you can see the hatched lines. These are areas which are actually restricted. So that actually surrounds the airport, which is the star here in the center. So significant obstacles when they're traveling to and from Daytona Beach Airport. And then when we look at the high voltage lines, this white line right here that goes diagonally down and then across to the right is mirrored by this dotted dash yellow line, is only 1,900 feet from the end of the runway. So actually facing the end of the runway. These towers approach 100 feet tall. So there is a risk associated with high power transmission lines. And then the fourth is limited emergency access. Of course, not just into any part of the Ocala National Forest, but when you look at Clay Lake Road that goes into Deep Woods Road, it's very, very narrow, 9 feet wide. And when it rains, the whole road puddles up. So emergency vehicles would have difficulty getting in there. Now, they are planning to try to widen this, I believe, to 20 feet, but that's really not listed as part of the scope either. And that would take out a significant number of additional trees in doing so in acreage. All right, if we take a look at the noise footprint, this impact is measured in the air, not on the ground. The traffic pattern has been shown as overlapping rectangular circuits for the runways, and I'll show that in the next slide. But the impact is, as I mentioned before, very high because this dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, 50 weeks per year, with multiple aircraft doing the circling. On the right here is a map of the flight pattern, and you can see the rectangles here that overlap, and you have departure and entries at different angles. But again, relative to this area, you've got Lake Woodruff here, Alexander Springs Wilderness here. You've got all these towns on the bottom here and Deer Haven over here. So the impact is substantial. And the flight altitude is only 1,000 to 2,000 feet because they're really just trying to do touch and goes and back up and then doing touch and goes and back up again. The noise impact itself, the red rectangle here is really the rectangle I showed earlier for the flight path. So this is where it's going to be very loud around this area. It actually comes right up to Deer Haven here and Fullerville down here. The yellow is what we can call street level noise. So the sound is starting to dissipate. And this is about a 4-mile wide rectangle here and about 10,000 square acres being impacted. This white line rectangle is where the noise starts fading out. And it's roughly 8 miles wide in both directions, encompassing about 41,000 acres. And this was kind of based on a Cessna 172 noise level, which is typical of what they're going to use for training. So we can compare this now to Embry-Riddle's 2026 Chino Valley, Arizona airport, which they just had approved. It was rezoned from ag and single family homes to a CUP for airport. So actually intending for airport operations. Now the Deepwood CUP, as we mentioned, doesn't match that usage here. And then at the council level, this was obviously heard, which we did not hear here in Lake County. And despite many residents and ours speaking in opposition, they voted 5-2 in favor of the Embry-Riddle project. And again, residents not heard in Lake County. The impact from that airport, they have operating hours spanning 18-hour window. So that's essentially daytime hours and a little bit of nighttime here. They can do up to 40 touch and goes per hour. So this is, again, mobile planes in rotation doing touch and goes. So it's one every 1.5 minutes. Now, Arizona seems to max limit their touch and goes to 110 per day, so they need to just operate within these hours. But we expect a similar rate here. That's going to be the main issue. We have no limit for touch and goes for Deepwoods Ranch Airport. So this 40 per hour could easily be 300 to 400 possible touch and goes a day, depending on how many students there are and the amount of training they want to do. So very, very significant impact. Affected lands, again, I'm not going to list them, but these are the ones that we talked about. The issue is that no noise study has been conducted, not by Embry-Riddle, not by the Forestry Service, not by FDOT, not by Lake County. No agency has modeled cumulative noise exposure over any of these protected lands or communities. So what's next? And this is to close out my report. Again, the main issue is that no single agency owns the entire picture. And the project is very complex, as you can see. Lake County, it was withdrawn before a public hearing. Code enforcement actually used Embry-Riddle's own lawyer response as their own. FDOT change use, ownership, and scale without review. FAA has no new filing for institutional training. In the Forestry Service, we don't know if segmenting is going on here because it doesn't match their scoping letter. So no agency has actually conducted a noise impact assessment, a wildlife hazard assessment, cumulative environmental review, or held a public hearing on the full scope of the project. And that's why I list here. So the call to action is we need to continue to write to state reps, the USDA, the Forestry Service, St. John's now, because they're involved with the environmental resource permitting, environmental groups that we can get involved and spread the word. We can request these listed studies to be performed and ask the Forestry Service to remove and change the categorical exclusion status. And Louise had sent sample emails to Susan for distributing and emailing out. But if possible, customize it and feel free to use any portion of this report for your use to submit. I think if there's any content, technical content, it tends to help your opposition comment. And we want to also continue to email the USDA Forestry Service to voice their opposition, because initially the end date was supposed to be March 31st for a decision. But after receiving the 500 comments, they pushed it back to May 31st. And then we continue to send them content from their reports. And now it's pushed back further to September 30th. So while this is still not exactly open for commenting, we can email directly to these forestry contacts. Two of them are in Tallahassee, and Brandon is actually Umatilla. Might be possible to try to set up a face-to-face meeting there. And we should also be asking why this project of such magnitude has been listed as CE. And then St. John's has recently, as I mentioned, seen an ERP application from Embry-Riddle. And this is the web page here with a comment button, which is currently working. And again, comments should be submitted with whatever content can provide. There are actually been 92 comments submitted as of today, this morning. So the issue here is that there are a lot of moving parts. There's no one agency seems to have a handle on the entire scope. And I think keeping things separated allows approval independent of each other. We need to keep the pressure on these agencies, write email with your concerns about the impacts to Ocala National Forest. Here I'm asking a couple questions. Can we get any support from Lake County, like the commissioners? Not necessarily Leslie, we know that she was for the project, but given what we know now, can we get any of them to make calls or support our efforts? Without the CFD, they seem to have washed their hands of it. Can we get environmental help, legal help to stop or slow the project? And here, asking for pro bono help, if anyone knows of any legal help that we can acquire. This is currently lacking and very costly, of course, but we'd like to try to keep these groups honest. So with that, thank you. Open for questions or comments. I know it's a lot of information, so maybe I will send a PDF version to Susan to distribute.
Great. Yeah, thank you for all that detailed summary of the issue. There's actually even more than this. I've seen some of the public records requests that you guys shared with me over the last couple of days, and there's even more details than this. This is a very good summary of what the status of some of these moving parts are. If you